The snow fell in thick, silent flakes, clinging to the chrome trim of the diner and blurring the neon sign that bled the word open into the Christmas Eve twilight. It was a snow that muffled the world, that promised quiet and stillness, but inside the man's chest, a different kind of storm churned. He sat in the last booth, the one with its back to the wall and a perfect, unobstructed view of the single entrance and the two exits. Habit. His name was Min, and habit was the armor he wore over his skin. The red vinyl of the seat was cracked and cold, a stark contrast to the warmth of the coffee mug he held between his palms. He didn't drink it. He simply used it as an anchor, a small point of heat in the vast, refrigerated landscape of his life. The organization had insisted on this. A blind date. A performance of normalcy to appease certain partners. They wanted to see a man, not a weapon. A man with ties, with softness, with something to lose. It was a strategic liability he was being forced to adopt, and he resented it with a cold, precise fury. He had scanned the file on the woman, Imani, age 23, caregiver to her nephew, address in a part of the city he wouldn't drive through without 2 cars. The agency that arranged these things was discreet, catering to men who paid for the illusion of a life they could never actually have. She was being paid to sit here with him for 2 hours. A simple transaction. He understood transactions. They were clean, predictable. Unlike the swirling snow, unlike the saccharine Christmas music leaking from the diner's speakers, and unlike the hollow ache in his own ribs that always grew louder this time of year. The bell over the door chimed, a tinny, cheerful sound that grated on his nerves. He didn't look up, not immediately. He watched her reflection first as it moved across the polished surface of the jukebox. A woman, larger than the file photo suggested, shaking snow from her shoulders. She wore a coat that had seen better winters, and beneath it, a sliver of soft pink fabric. She was holding the hand of a small child, a boy bundled so thoroughly against the cold that only his wide, curious eyes were visible. Min's jaw tightened. A child had not been part of the transaction. Children were complications. They were variables in a world that punished miscalculation. He felt a familiar urge to rise, to abort the entire charade and retreat to the sterile silence of his high-rise apartment. But he remained seated, a statue carved from discipline, his hands still wrapped around the cooling mug. This was just another job. Endure. Observe. Depart. The mantra had kept him alive for a decade. He saw no reason it would fail him now. He finally lifted his gaze from the reflection to the reality, just as she spotted him, her expression a mixture of apprehension and weary resolve. For a moment, he forgot she was being paid. She just looked like a woman trying to find a safe harbor in a storm. Imani felt the man's eyes on her before she located his booth. It was a stare that didn't just see. It assessed. It was heavy, like a physical weight in the warm, greasy air of the diner. She squeezed her nephew Noah's hand, a small reassurance that was as much for herself as it was for him. There he is, sweet boy. Be good for Auntie, okay? Noah nodded, his gaze fixed on the miniature Santa figurine glued to the top of the napkin dispenser. The agency had been vague, promising a generous payment for 2 hours of her time. Enough to cover rent for January and buy Noah the ridiculously expensive dinosaur toy he dreamed about. Desperation was a sharp-toothed motivator. It had pushed her past her own fear, past the strangeness of meeting a man whose name she had only learned that afternoon from a sterile email. Mr. Kong. Be polite. Be pleasant. Do not ask personal questions. The rules were simple. She guided Noah into the booth, sliding him onto the vinyl seat before sitting down herself. The man, Mr. Kong, was even more intimidating in person. He was handsome in a severe, sculpted way, with eyes that seemed to hold no light at all. He wore a simple black cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He didn't smile or offer a greeting. He just watched her, his stillness a profound and unsettling contrast to the diner's gentle hum. She unzipped Noah's puffy coat, revealing his small frame and the faded superhero shirt beneath. This is my nephew, Noah, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. My sitter canceled last minute. I hope that's okay. The man's gaze flickered to Noah for a bare second before returning to her. His silence was an answer in itself. It was not okay. It was a breach of protocol. She felt a flush of defensive anger. She was doing her best. Wasn't that enough for anyone anymore? She slid Noah a menu and a crayon she brought from home. "Why don't you draw me a picture of that Santa?" she murmured, creating a small, safe bubble for him in this tense, adult space. Then she faced the silent man across from her. "I'm Imani," he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. I know his voice was low, a quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate with unspoken power. She saw his hands then, resting on the table. They were perfectly still, elegant and controlled. They looked like hands that could break things without ever raising a sweat. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Imani, who filled the anxious silences in her life with chatter, found herself at a loss. This man's quiet wasn't empty. It was full. It was a wall, and she had no idea how to breach it. A waitress, a cheerful woman with tinsel in her hair, came to take their order. Imani asked for a hot chocolate for Noah and a coffee for herself. Min ordered nothing. He simply dismissed the waitress with a subtle gesture that was somehow more commanding than a shout. The interaction was a micro-display of his world, efficient, silent, and entirely on his terms. Imani wrapped her hands around her own mug when it arrived, mimicking his posture. Maybe if she mirrored him, she could understand the language he was speaking. She watched Noah, who was now happily scribbling a wild, yellow sun on the back of a paper placemat, oblivious to the strange gravity pulling all the air out of their booth. He was her anchor, her reason. She was here, in this bizarre Christmas Eve pantomime, for him. She looked back at Min, whose gaze had drifted towards the window, to the endlessly falling snow. His profile was sharp against the frosted glass, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the coldness. It was a profound loneliness, a desolation so deep it seemed to suck the warmth from the air around him. It was a look she recognized. She saw it in the mirror sometimes, in the exhausted hours after Noah was asleep and the apartment was too quiet. The recognition was a small, unsettling spark of connection. The diner's radio, which had been murmuring a series of upbeat holiday tunes, transitioned into a new song. A children's choir began to sing Silent Night. The melody was pure, clear, and achingly sweet. It filled the small space, a sound of uncomplicated innocence. Imani loved this carol. It reminded her of her mother, of Christmases that felt safe and whole. She glanced at Min, expecting him to be impassive, but his armor had cracked. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. His gaze was fixed on nothing, on a point somewhere in the distant past that was suddenly playing out behind his eyes. He was no longer in the diner. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and painful. Then, the unthinkable happened. A single tear escaped his eye. It traced a silent, glistening path down his cheek. He didn't move to wipe it away. It was as if he was so unused to the sensation, so disconnected from his own grief, that he didn't even recognize it as his own. He turned his head sharply toward the window, a reflexive attempt to hide the breach, his body rigid with shame and fury at his own weakness. The moment was so intensely private that Imani felt like an intruder. Her first instinct was to look away, to grant him the dignity of her ignorance. But something held her. The raw, unguarded pain on his face was too human to ignore. It cut through the intimidation, the wealth, the silent threat he projected. In that instant, he wasn't a powerful man. He was just a man who was hurting, on a night when the whole world was pretending to be joyful. Her own exhaustion, her own quiet struggles, resonated with that single, silent tear. She knew what it was to hold it all together until a sound or a smell broke you apart. Without thinking, without calculating, she leaned forward slightly, her voice barely a whisper, soft enough not to startle him but firm enough to be heard over the choir. "Don't cry," she said, the words simple, direct. "It's okay. You can borrow me as your girlfriend for the night." It wasn't a flirtation. It wasn't a joke. It was an offering. A strange, clumsy, but deeply sincere extension of comfort from one lonely person to another. A promise that for the next hour or so, he didn't have to be completely alone in his grief. Min flinched, as if her words had been a physical strike. He turned back from the window, his eyes dark with a complex storm of emotions, shock, anger, and a flicker of something so raw and vulnerable it was almost unbearable to witness. The tear was gone, erased with a swift, angry movement of his thumb. His control slammed back into place, the mask of cold indifference settling over his features, but the crack remained. She had seen behind it. He stared at her, his mind racing to categorize her response. Pity? Manipulation? A clumsy attempt to fulfill the terms of their transaction? He couldn't process the simple, unadorned sincerity in her expression. Kindness, without an angle, was a foreign language in his world. In his experience, warmth was a weapon, a tool used to find a weakness. Yet, her eyes held no artifice. They were just kind. And tired. So, very tired. His first instinct was to reassert control, to reduce this messy, emotional moment back into the clean lines of a business deal. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope, sliding it across the slick surface of the table. It landed softly next to the salt shaker. It contained 10 times the agreed-upon amount. For your trouble, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was his default solution, money. Money built walls. Money bought silence. Money erased complications. Imani looked down at the envelope, then back up at his face. She saw the wall he was rebuilding, brick by painful brick. She felt a surge of something hot and protective, not just for herself, but for the broken man he was trying so desperately to hide. She placed her hand on the envelope and slowly, deliberately, pushed it back across the table toward him. I'm not for sale, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an unshakable firmness. And neither is my kindness, his eyes narrowed. This was not the expected response. People took his money. Always. The deal was for a date, she continued, holding his gaze. To sit here and have a conversation. This is a date. So, let's just be here. She was drawing a line, not in anger, but in dignity. She would not allow him to cheapen her empathy, to turn it into another commodity he could purchase. Before Min could formulate a reply, a small voice broke the tension. Why were you sad? Noah had looked up from his drawing, his crayon poised over the paper. He was looking directly at Min, his expression one of pure, unfiltered curiosity. Children have no concept of social armor. They see a thing and they name it. The question, so simple and direct, hung in the air between them, more powerful than any threat or negotiation. Min was completely disarmed. He had strategies for dealing with armed rivals, with treacherous partners, with corrupt officials. He had no strategy for a 5-year-old boy asking him about his feelings. He looked at Noah, at the innocent sincerity in the child's face, and felt the foundations of his world tilt. He had built a fortress around himself, and a woman with tired eyes and a small child with a yellow crayon were dismantling it without even trying. He was a man who controlled everything, and in this cheap diner booth, he had lost control of the one thing he guarded most fiercely, himself. The fragile truce in their booth, woven from a child's question and a woman's quiet refusal, was shattered by the violent chime of the bell over the door. It wasn't the gentle ring of a customer entering. It was a clang, harsh and sudden. 2 men filled the doorway, bringing the biting cold in with them. They were big, dressed in cheap parkas that didn't hide the bulk of their shoulders, and their eyes were not taking in the festive decorations. They were scanning, hunting. Their gazes swept the room and locked onto Min's booth with the chilling precision of predators finding their prey. The entire atmosphere of the diner curdled instantly. The cheerful holiday music seemed to mock the sudden, lethal tension. Imani felt it first as a prickle on her skin, a primal instinct screaming that the rules of the world had just changed. She saw the shift in Min. It was terrifying. He didn't tense up, he settled. The coiled energy in him became something dense, focused, and utterly still. It was the calm at the absolute center of a hurricane. His eyes, which had shown a flicker of vulnerability moments before, were now flat, cold, and ancient. This was the man she had sensed beneath the surface. This was the danger. He moved with a speed that defied belief. One moment he was sitting, the next he was on his feet, a dark shape positioning himself almost casually between the approaching men and the booth where she and Noah sat. He had become a human shield. Imani, he said, his voice a low, lethal command that cut through the diner's hum. Stay behind me. Do not move, he spoke to the men in Korean. The language was different from the clipped, authoritative tone he'd used on the phone. This was guttural, a language of the street, laced with unmistakable menace. Imani couldn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. It was a warning, a final chance. One of the men smirked, dismissing the warning, and reached inside his coat. It was the last mistake he would make. Min's movement was not a fight. It was a piece of brutal physics. He closed the distance in a single fluid step. There was the sickening crack of a wrist breaking, a choked gasp of pain. He used the first man's body as a shield and a pivot, spinning him into his partner. An elbow struck with surgical precision at the base of the second man's skull. Both men crumpled to the linoleum floor, unconscious before they even fully fell. It was over in less than 3 seconds. Utterly silent, brutally efficient, and absolutely terrifying. The diner erupted into chaos. A waitress screamed. A plate shattered. Patrons scrambled from their booths, fumbling for their phones or the door. In the midst of the panic, Min was an island of deadly calm. He turned, his face an unreadable mask, and grabbed Imani's arm. His grip was like iron, not painful but unyieldingly firm. "We have to go." Now she was frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile the quiet, grieving man from moments ago with his terrifyingly capable predator. But then she looked at Noah, whose eyes were wide with fear, his bottom lip trembling, and her own fear was burned away by a ferocious, protective instinct. She scooped him into her arms, her body a shield for his, and allowed Min to pull them through the pandemonium and out into the biting, cleansing cold of the Christmas Eve snow. The car was a black hole that swallowed sound. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, the sirens, the shouting, and the chaos of the diner vanished, replaced by the hushed, leathery silence of extreme wealth. It was a German sedan, anonymous on the outside, a fortress within. The engine was a distant, almost imperceptible hum. Min navigated the snowy streets with an unnerving calm, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. He wasn't fleeing, he was executing a tactical withdrawal. Imani sat in the passenger seat, trembling, her arms wrapped tightly around her own body. In the back, buckled into a child's seat that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, Noah had finally succumbed to the shock and exhaustion, his small head lolling to the side in sleep. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the diner was draining away, leaving behind a cold, shaky dread. She had just seen a man break other men, as if they were twigs. The same man who had wept over A Christmas Carol. The paradox was too much for her tired mind to hold. Who was he? What had she stumbled into? Min didn't speak. He drove for what felt like an eternity, the city lights blurring into streaks of color through the snow-streaked windshield. He was giving her space, letting the silence do its work. He knew what she had seen, and he knew that words now would be useless. Action was the only language that mattered. He reached into the glove compartment and retrieved a bottle of water, sealed and cold, and passed it to her without a word. It was a simple gesture, but it felt profound. An offering of normalcy in the wake of violence. A few minutes later, he shrugged off his own coat, a heavy, dark wool overcoat that smelled faintly of cold night air and something expensive, and draped it over her shoulders. It was incredibly warm, a cocoon of impossible softness that felt like a shield against the shivering in her bones. She pulled it tighter, inhaling the scent, feeling the sheer weight of it as a form of comfort. It felt safe. The irony was not lost on her. Safety, offered by the most dangerous man she had ever met. Her mind flashed back to the diner, to the chaos, and a sudden, sharp pang of loss hit her. Noah's drawing. The cheerful, lopsided yellow sun he had scribbled on the placemat was still there, left behind on the sticky table. It felt like a piece of his innocence had been abandoned in that violent place. It was a silly thing to worry about after what had just happened, but the thought of that small piece of paper being swept up with the shattered plates and thrown into the trash felt like another violation, another piece of their fragile world broken. They finally pulled into a heated, underground garage, the stark concrete a jarring contrast to the soft snow outside. The building was a sleek, anonymous tower of glass and steel. He led them to an elevator that opened directly into an apartment. It was vast, minimalist, and sterile, furnished with expensive, but impersonal pieces. It looked less like a home and more like a high-end holding cell. "You will be safe here," he said, the first words he'd spoken since the diner. His voice was flat again, the command tone from before replaced by a quiet authority. He showed her the spare bedroom. For the boy, he pointed to a kitchen stocked with unopened, gourmet provisions. There's food, he was all logistics, all function. He was building walls around them, this time made of concrete and security systems instead of silence and money. He was a protector, but his methods were as unsettling as the threat itself. He retreated to the living area, leaving her to settle Noah into the bed. The child didn't even stir. As she tucked a soft, gray blanket around him, she felt the full weight of her situation crash down on her. She was in a stranger's apartment, a man who moved in a world of casual brutality, and she had no idea what would happen next. She walked back into the living room, her heart pounding. Min was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights twinkling through the falling snow. He had his phone to his ear, and he was speaking in that same low, authoritative Korean. He was a king in his castle, moving pieces on a board she couldn't even see. The phone call was brief, a series of clipped commands. Min listened to the report from his subordinate, his expression unchanging. The diner had been cleaned. The local police had been placated with a story of a gang-related scuffle, a narrative supported by a generous donation to their benevolent association. The two men were being dealt with, interrogated to find out who had sent them, who had been reckless enough to make a move on Christmas Eve. But that was secondary. The primary objective had shifted. He gave a new set of orders. He recited Imani's address from memory, the one from the agency file. He wanted a full workup on the building, the owner, the neighborhood. He wanted his people to watch the place. He had seen the worn look of her coat, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He knew what kind of life was lived in apartments at that address. It was a life of vulnerability, of leaky faucets and landlords who preyed on fear. A world away from this climate-controlled tower, but a world whose dangers were just as real, if not as sudden, as a knife in an alley. And one more thing, he said, his voice dropping even lower. The booth. The last one on the left. There was a drawing on the table. A child's drawing. A son. Find it, there was a pause on the other end of the line, a flicker of confusion from his lieutenant, a man accustomed to orders involving weapons and surveillance, not crayons. Min didn't elaborate. Find it, he repeated, the command absolute. He hung up. He turned from the window. Imani was standing in the doorway to the living room, watching him, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She looked small and lost in the vast, empty space. He felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion stir within him. It was not pity. It was responsibility. He had pulled her into a storm. The storm was his natural habitat, but it would destroy her. It was his duty, then, to steer her out of it, to deliver her to a shore she couldn't have reached on her own. This was a debt, a transaction of a different kind. Her uncalculated kindness in exchange for his calculated protection. It was the only way he could make sense of the warmth she had offered him, by translating it into the cold, hard currency of safety. He had spent his entire adult life taking things from people, their power, their territory, their lives. Now, for the first time, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to give something back. Not just money, but something real. A shield. A sanctuary. He walked over to the sleek, modern kitchen. He opened a cabinet and took out 2 mugs, his movements precise and silent. He filled a kettle with filtered water and set it to boil. He would make her tea. It was a small domestic act, so alien to his nature that it felt almost revolutionary. It was a beginning, a negotiation for a new kind of peace, in a war she didn't even know he was fighting for her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the enormous windows, glinting off the pristine surfaces of the apartment. The snow had stopped, leaving the city draped in a blanket of clean, white silence. It felt like the world had been scrubbed clean. Imani had barely slept, dozing fitfully on the plush sofa, her ears attuned to every sound in the unfamiliar space. Noah was still asleep, a small, peaceful lump under the expensive gray duvet. The quiet was absolute, a stark contrast to the constant city hum and noisy neighbors of her own building. It was the kind of quiet that cost a great deal of money. She heard a soft click as the elevator door opened, and her body went rigid. Min stepped into the apartment. He was dressed in another impeccably tailored dark suit, but he looked tired, the skin around his eyes tight. He was carrying 2 large paper bags. He set them on the marble kitchen island without a word. One was filled with groceries, milk, eggs, fruit, a box of the sugary cereal he must have assumed a child would like. The other contained takeout boxes from a high-end bakery, the air filling with the warm, comforting scent of fresh pastries and coffee. He then reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled something out. It was a piece of paper, the placemat from the diner. It was slightly crumpled and had a faint, greasy stain in one corner, but it was intact. Noah's lopsided, beaming yellow sun stared up at them. He held it out to her. Imani took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. His skin was cold. She stared at the drawing, this small, insignificant scrap that he had sent his men back into a scene of violence to retrieve. It was the most eloquent apology she had ever received. It said he understood what was important, that he saw past the chaos to the small, human thing that had been lost within it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He gave a single, sharp nod, as if to dismiss the weight of the gesture. He busied himself with making coffee, his movements economical and precise. The silence felt different this morning. It was less of a wall and more of a space, a quiet room they could both occupy, without needing to fill it with noise. As he handed her a mug of coffee, he finally spoke, his gaze not quite meeting hers. "The song," he said, the word hanging in the air. "Silent Night. My mother used to sing it," he paused, and she could tell the admission cost him something. "On Christmas Eve." Before everything, he didn't elaborate on what everything was, and she didn't ask. She didn't need to. The word was heavy enough to contain a lifetime of loss. "The men from the diner were a message from a rival," he continued, his tone shifting back to the familiar, factual cadence. "By being with me, you became a target, a liability. They know your address. They know about your nephew." The words landed like ice chips in her stomach. This wasn't just about a random fight. His world had followed them, its shadow now falling directly over her life, over Noah. "I am responsible for that," he said, his voice flat but carrying an immense weight. "And I will fix it." He slid a single key and a crisp, new lease agreement across the counter. "This is a new apartment. 3 bedrooms. In a secure building near a good school. The first year's rent is paid. Your possessions will be moved this afternoon. Your old landlord has been persuaded to forget your tenancy." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A solution already executed. This was his power, not in violence, but in logistics. The sheer, overwhelming force of his resources. Imani looked at the key, then at him. The old, defensive pride flared up. This was charity, a gilded cage. But then she looked at the drawing in her hand, at the sleeping form of her nephew in the other room, and she saw it for what it was. It wasn't charity. It was a life raft. He wasn't giving her a gift. He was repaying a debt he felt he owed. He was offering her the only thing he truly possessed, safety. "You showed me a kindness I had forgotten existed," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, and the desolation she'd seen in them before was still there, but now it had a crack of light in it. "Let me offer you safety in return. It's the only thing I have of value." She thought of her leaky roof, of the broken lock on her building's front door, of the fear she lived with every day as a young woman raising a child alone. She picked up the key. "Okay," she said. And in that single word, a new world began. 3 months later, the last of the city's snow had melted, giving way to the pale, determined green of early spring. The sunlight that filled Imani's new apartment was different. It was warm and hopeful, and it didn't have to fight its way through grimy, barred windows. It poured through clean, wide panes of glass that overlooked a small park where Noah now played after school. The apartment was filled with the scent of lemon polish and the sound of Noah's laughter as he chattered away about his day. Imani was at the kitchen table, a textbook on child psychology open in front of her. She had enrolled in a course at the local community college, the first step on a path she had long ago abandoned as an impossible dream. Everything was different now. The constant, grinding anxiety about money and safety had receded, leaving space for other things to grow: hope, ambition, peace. The foundation of this new life felt strange, built upon the bedrock of a violent night, but it was solid. It was real. The doorbell rang, a soft, pleasant chime. It was Min. He came by twice a week, always on the same days at the same time. His visits were quiet rituals. He never stayed long, but his presence had become a strange, anchoring point in their week. Noah ran to the door, yelling his name.
Min.
You're here. I built a rocket ship. Min entered, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as he looked down at the boy. He had shed the severe black suit for dark jeans and a gray Henley, an effort to fit into their world. The armor was still there, in the controlled way he moved, in the constant awareness in his eyes, but it was lighter now. He crouched down to Noah's level, his movements still precise, but no longer threatening. A rocket ship? To where? To the moon, Noah declared, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward a magnificent, chaotic structure of cardboard boxes and duct tape in the middle of the living room. Min allowed himself to be led, sitting on the floor with the boy, his long legs folded awkwardly. He listened with solemn attention as Noah explained the complex schematics of his creation. Imani watched them from the kitchen, a warmth spreading through her chest. He was so gentle with Noah, so patient. He was a man of violent extremes, but here, in the sanctuary he had built for them, he was learning a different language, a language of quiet presence and simple play. She brought him a mug of tea, the way she always did. He took it with a murmur of thanks, his fingers brushing hers. The touch no longer felt cold. On the wall above the sofa, in a simple black frame, was Noah's drawing of the yellow sun. It was the first thing she had hung in the new apartment. It was a reminder, a testament to a strange and terrible night that had, against all odds, led them here. It was a symbol of the light that had broken through the darkest of armors. Later, after Noah was in bed, they sat in the quiet living room, the city lights twinkling outside. They didn't talk much, but the silence was comfortable now, a shared space. The men from the diner, he said suddenly, looking out the window. The organization that sent them is no longer a problem, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He was still fighting wars in a world she would never see, but he was keeping that world from touching hers. He was a wall, but now he stood between her and the storm, not between her and himself. Thank you, Min, she said softly. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the light in his eyes seemed to come from within. No, he said, his voice low and sincere. Thank you, Imani. They were a strange, impossible constellation. A woman rebuilding her life, a child who saw no monsters, and a man learning to be something more than a weapon. The past was not erased, and the future was not without its shadows. But here, in this quiet, sunlit room, they had built something that felt like home. A family forged not by blood, but by a shared moment of grace on a cold Christmas Eve.